The cold black marble of the Grand Archive Hall offered no mercy. Elara hit the floor hard. The jarring impact sent a sharp ache through her knees, but she bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to let a single gasp escape her throat. The heavy oak doors behind her had barely slammed shut before the royal guards forced her down, their grips bruising her fragile shoulders. She was just a scribe, an unaffiliated omega wrapped in a faded gray tunic, the hem still damp with the winter snow she had dragged in from the outer courtyards. Her fingers, heavily stained with blue ink, trembled slightly, but they did not reach out to beg. Instead, they tightened around the one thing she possessed in this world, a carved bone cylinder clutched desperately against her chest. Above her, the silver torches lining the stone walls cast long, predatory shadows across the hall. Standing amidst those shadows was Queen Mother Valerius, her face twisted in a mask of absolute disdain. "A mistranslation, you claim?" The Queen Mother's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, sharp enough to cut glass. She paced slowly down the steps of the dais, the heavy velvet of her skirts sweeping the dust. "You dare rewrite the sacred history of the Frostpeak Kingdom. You dare alter the ancient texts to suggest that the ruling line shares authority with a forgotten breed of moon worshippers?" Elara kept her chin level. The air in the archive hall smelled of old parchment, dry leather, and the looming scent of execution. She knew the truth of the texts. She had spent nights deciphering the Proto-Wolf dialect, uncovering the erased history of the Moon Priestess line. But the truth was a dangerous thing to hold in a kingdom built on absolute power. "I translated the runes exactly as they were carved, my queen," Elara said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of any defiance that could be mistaken for insolence, but completely devoid of submission. "The history is not mine to rewrite. I only read what the stone remembers." "Insolent little rat," Valerius hissed, stopping just a few feet away. She looked down at Elara's ink-stained fingers and the worn gray fabric of her clothes. "You are an omega permitted to touch the royal archives out of sheer pity, and yet you use that privilege to spread treason." Elara did not lower her eye. She felt the heavy gaze of the kingdom's nobles pressing against her back, waiting for her to break. They expected her to weep. They expected her to press her forehead against the freezing black stone and plead for her miserable life. She merely tightened her grip on the carved bone cylinder. Inside it was a secret she had protected since childhood, a secret her mother died to conceal. If she was going to die tonight, she would die with her back straight. "Cut out her tongue," Valerius commanded, turning her back on Elara with a dismissive wave of her hand. "A scribe who cannot speak the truth has no need for a voice. Let her live in the silent darkness she belongs in." A collective murmur rippled through the gathered court, but no one dared to step forward. The law of the Queen Mother was absolute. A royal guard moved instantly. He drew a ceremonial blade from his belt, the steel catching the torchlight in a cruel, gleaming flash. He grabbed Elara by the shoulder, hauling her roughly upward, forcing her chin up to expose her throat. Elara's breath hitched. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but she forced her eyes to remain open. She looked past the guard, past the Queen Mother, straight toward the elevated shadows at the back of the hall. King Kaelen sat on the ancient throne of Frostpeak. He had not spoken a single word since she was dragged into the hall. The Alpha King of Frostpeak was a terrifying force of nature, a man who ruled with the brutal efficiency of a winter storm. He wore a heavy black fur cloak over dark leather armor, his broad shoulders perfectly still. His piercing silver-gray eyes watched the scene unfold with an oppressive, cold stillness. He did not look at her with pity, nor with anger. He looked at her the way a predator assesses a shift in the wind. The guard's fingers dug into Elara's jaw. The cold edge of the blade hovered inches from her mouth. Elara did not scream. She simply held the king's silver-gray stare, her violet eyes dark and defiant. In the crushing silence of the hall, King Kaelen finally moved. He didn't stand, he didn't shout. He simply raised his right hand from the armrest of the throne. On his index finger, the silver signet ring of the Iron Sovereign caught the light. Suddenly, a visible wave of frost bloomed across the dark metal of the ring. The temperature in the entire Grand Archive Hall plummeted violently in a fraction of a second, the breath of the nobles turning into white mist. A suffocating alpha aura slammed down on the room, so heavy and absolute that the guard holding Elara immediately dropped his blade. It clattered loudly against the black marble. "Halt," Kaelen said. His voice was low, devoid of a shout, yet it rattled the ancient stones of the archive walls. The silence that followed the king's command was heavier than the winter air outside. The guard who had been holding the blade scrambled backward, terrified by the sudden drop in temperature. Kaelen rose from his black marble throne. He descended the stairs with measured, deliberate steps, his heavy fur cloak sweeping over the stone. With every step he took, the nobles in the hall instinctively stepped back, bowing their heads out of sheer survival instinct. Queen Mother Valeria stiffened, her eyes narrowing as her son approached. "Kaelen," she warned, her voice tight. "She is a traitor. She insulted the bloodline. I am well within my right to silence her." "You are within your right to demand discipline, Mother," Kaelen replied, his tone perfectly even, completely devoid of anger, but carrying an absolute finality. "But you are not within your right to break the law of the first winter. A scribe of the Grand Archive is bound to the stone, not the crown. No blood shall be spilled on this floor without a formal trial of the council." "She is a mere Omega," Valeria snapped, losing a fraction of her composed facade. "You invoke the ancient law for a girl who smells of nothing but cheap ink and old dust." Kaelen stopped. He was standing only a few feet away from Elara now. Elara remained on her bruised knees, her violet eyes looking up at him. She expected to see pity, or perhaps the arrogant amusement of a ruler playing games with his court. But there was nothing of the sort in Kaelen's lever-gray eyes. He was looking at her with a sharp, calculating intensity, like a commander assessing a piece of the battlefield that didn't quite belong. And then it happened. A draft of cold wind swept through the hall, rustling Elara's faded gray tunic. For a fraction of a second, the heavy, stale scent of ink, old parchment, and dust fractured. Through that tiny crack in her sealed scent, something else slipped out. It was faint, barely a whisper of a scent, but to the obsidian dyer inside Kaelen, it was like a deafening roar. Frost bloom, the rare, intoxicating scent of a flower that only bloomed in the deepest, deadliest parts of winter. It hit Kaelen's senses with the force of a physical blow. His wolf, an ancient and disciplined beast that had never once fought his control, suddenly thrashed violently against his ribs, demanding he close the distance between them. Kaelen's jaw locked. He clenched his right hand into a tight fist at his side, his nails digging ruthlessly into his own palm to ground himself. He was the Iron Sovereign. He did not lose control, not over a scent, and certainly not over an unaffiliated scribe. He forced his lungs to take a slow, shallow breath, burying the sudden, violent possessiveness that had just flared in his chest. "The law," Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave, raspy with the effort of holding his wolf back, "does not distinguish between omegas and lords. She will not be mutilated today." Elara's fingers tightened around the carved bone cylinder against her chest. She did not thank him. She knew better than to trust the mercy of a royal. But for a fleeting moment, she noticed the way his knuckles had turned stark white. "If she cannot be executed, my king, then she must be removed." The new voice was smooth, cultured, and perfectly calibrated to sound reasonable. The crowd parted once more as Lady Seraphina stepped into the torchlight. She was dressed in a pristine ivory gown, a false Luna who wore her ambition as elegantly as she wore her pearls. Seraphina offered Kaelen a graceful, practiced bow before turning her sharp, dark eyes toward Elara with barely concealed disgust. In her hands, Seraphina held a rolled parchment sealed with red wax. "The Queen Mother is right to be concerned," Seraphina continued, stepping closer to Kaelen, deliberately invading the space between him and Elara. "While organizing the Eastern Archives this morning, my attendants discovered this edict. It details the punishment for scribes who attempt to falsify royal lineage." She unrolled the parchment with a snap. "If the king's law forbids the spilling of her blood without a trial, then the law of exile must apply. She is a seed of rebellion, Kaelen. She must be stripped of her position, marked as a traitor, and cast out into the winter wastes immediately." Seraphina smiled, holding the forged parchment out to the king. It was a flawless political T-rap. If Kaelen refused, he would be protecting a proven traitor in front of his entire court, undermining his own strict adherence to the law. Elara looked at the parchment. She knew every document in the Grand Archive. That edict did not exist yesterday. The cold stones of the hall seemed to press in on her. They were not going to cut her tongue. They were going to throw her into the freezing wasteland to die silently, erasing the truth of her bloodline forever. The archive annex was a narrow, windowless cage of stone and rotting wood, hidden behind the towering bookshelves of the grand hall. It was freezing. Elara sat on the floor, her back pressed against the freezing wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The carved bone cylinder rested safely in her lap. The council had not exiled her immediately. The Queen Mother, infuriated by Kaelen's public defiance, had demanded a formal assembly at dawn to ratify the forged decree. Until then, Elara was a prisoner in the very place she had spent her life working. But the cold was not what made her hands tremble. It was the burning. A sharp, searing heat radiated from the back of her neck, just beneath the collar of her gray tunic. The faded, crescent-shaped birthmark she had carried all her life was suddenly alive, throbbing with a painful, frantic rhythm. It had started the moment the king's aura filled the hall, and it grew worse the longer she remained in the shadow of the Frostpeak throne. Her sealed bloodline was reacting to the ancient seat of power, clawing against the magical restraints the Queen Mother had secretly placed upon her as a child. Elara closed her violet eyes, pressing a cold, ink-stained hand to the back of her neck to soothe the sting. "If the decree is real, a scribe of your intelligence would have destroyed it years ago." The voice came from the shadows, low and quiet. but it carried a weight that made the dust in the air seem to settle. Elara's breath hitched. She opened her eyes. King Kaelen stood in the narrow archway of the annex. He had discarded the heavy fur cloak, wearing only his dark leather armor and the silver signet ring. Without the court, without the nobles and the Queen Mother, his presence was even more overwhelming. He did not fill the room with noise. He filled it with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Elara slowly rose to her feet. Her knees ached terribly, but she forced her spine straight. She held the bone cylinder against her stomach, her chin level as she met his silver-gray gaze. "The decree Lady Seraphina presented is a forgery, Your Majesty," Elara said. Her voice was remarkably steady for a woman facing a death sentence. The ink on that parchment had a slight sheen under the torchlight. Century-old iron gall ink dries to a matte, rusted brown. Anyone who spends more than an hour in these archives would know that. Kaelen stepped into the anne. He moved with the terrifying silence of an apex predator on the hunt. "My mother believes you are a threat to the crown," Kaelen said, stopping barely 2 paces from her. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact. "Seraphina believes you are a traitor who wishes to divide the pack. Tell me, scribe, what do you believe you are?" "I am a reader of the stone," Elara answered instantly. She did not flinch, even as the burning on her neck intensified, sending sharp spikes of pain down her spine. "I translate the history the first winter left behind. If the truth divides your pack, my king, then your pack is held together by lies." Kaelen's eyes narrowed. The sheer audacity of her words should have warranted immediate punishment. An unaffiliated Omega speaking to the Alpha King of Frostpeak about his kingdom's fragility was a direct challenge to his authority. But his wolf did not want to punish her. His wolf was captivated. Kaelen watched the way she held herself. There was no subservience in her posture, no trembling lip, no scent of fear. Instead, the faint, elusive scent of frost bloom drifted through the dusty air again, teasing his senses, making his canines ache with a sudden primal need to pull her closer. He looked at her ink-stained fingers gripping the bone cylinder. He looked at the frayed edges of her sleeve. Everything about her screamed poverty and low status. Yet she stood before him with the unyielding grace of a monarch. "You did not beg for your life in the hall," Kaelen observed softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "Most men would have wept before the blade even cleared its sheath." "Tears do not stop blades, Your Majesty," Elara replied, her violet eyes flashing with quiet resolve. "And I refuse to give the Queen Mother the satisfaction of my terror." The pain at the back of her neck flared violently, a sudden brutal spike of heat that made her wince. She instinctively took a step back, trying to put distance between herself and the overpowering force of his alpha aura. As she moved, she stepped into the narrow shaft of pale moonlight filtering through the high ventilation grate above. The silver light washed over her. It caught the single natural streak of pure silver in her dark brown hair, illuminating it like a crown of spun moonlight. In that fleeting second, the dusty annex seemed to fade away. Kaelen saw past the faded gray tunic. He saw the proud lift of her chin, the delicate but aristocratic line of her jaw, and the ancient, quiet power radiating from her very bones. Kaelen went entirely still. The breath stalled in his chest. That was not the aura of an Omega. That was not the presence of a broken servant. The Iron Sovereign stared at the scribe, bathed in moonlight. and for the first time in his meticulous, strictly ordered life, he realized that the history of his kingdom might be entirely wrong. Dawn broke over Frostpeak Kingdom, casting a pale, unforgiving light through the high frosted windows of the Grand Archive Hall. The Council of Elders had assembled. 12 men and women wrapped in heavy furs of gray and white stood in a rigid semicircle at the base of the dais. Queen Mother Valerius stood at the center, radiating a triumphant, icy authority. Beside her, Lady Seraphina looked the picture of perfect royal grace, holding a silver tray that bore 2 items, a formal marriage pact and a branding iron glowing a dull, angry red from the hall's braziers. Elara was dragged out of the annex and thrown onto the cold black marble before them. She stumbled but caught herself before her face could hit the stone. Her knees, already heavily bruised from the night before, screamed in protest, but she forced herself to stand upright. She brushed a layer of dust from her frayed gray tunic and adjusted her grip on the carved bone cylinder. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her expression remained an impenetrable mask of calm. On the throne above, King Kaelen watched her. He was perfectly still, his broad shoulders squared beneath his black fur cloak, his silver-gray eyes unreadable. But beneath the surface, the Iron Sovereign was waging a brutal war against his own east. The faint scent of frost bloom was still there, clinging to the air around her, tearing at his hard-won discipline. "The decree has been verified by the elders, Your Majesty," Valerius announced, her voice echoing with dangerous satisfaction. "Scribe Elara is found guilty of historical treason. Exile is the mandated punishment. However, considering the unrest this rumor might cause among the lower packs..." The Queen Mother gestured to the glowing iron on Seraphina's tray. "She must be branded with the mark of the Forsaken before she is cast out. A public confession of her lies, sealed in her flesh, so that no pack in the winter wastes will ever offer her shelter." A murmur of agreement rippled through the elders. "Furthermore," Valerius continued, her eyes shifting to her son, "the court requires stability. A king without a Luna invites rebellion. Lady Seraphina has proven her loyalty and vigilance. You will sign the mating pact today, Kaelen. It is the will of the council." It was a masterclass in political maneuvering. Valerius was tying the execution of Elara's dignity directly to the security of the crown. If Kaelen refused the branding, he appeared weak on treason. If he refused the marriage, he defied the council's mandate for stability. Seraphina stepped forward, offering the glowing iron to the captain of the guard. "Kneel, scribe," Seraphina commanded, her voice dripping with venom maws. "It is pity. Confess your lies to the king, accept the mark, and perhaps the winter will be swift when you are thrown into the snow." The captain advanced, a massive brute of a wolf, holding the searing iron. The heat radiating from the metal made Elara's skin prickle. The brand was shaped like a broken wolf's skull, the ultimate symbol of shame. "Force her down," Valerius ordered. 2 guards moved to flank Elara, reaching out to grab her shoulders and drive her into the stone. But Elara did not cower. With a sudden fluid grace that betrayed her supposed Omega status, she violently twisted her shoulders, breaking their grip. She took a step back, planting her boots firmly on the black marble. She clutched the bone cylinder to her chest like a shield. "I will not kneel," Elara said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs of the hall like a silver blade. "I have spoken no lies. I have forged no texts. "You may burn my flesh, Lady Seraphina, but you cannot burn the truth out of the stone." The sheer defiance in her tone sent a shockwave through the elders. Seraphina's perfect smile cracked, her dark eyes flashing with genuine hatred. "Break her legs if you must," Valerius shrieked, finally losing her regal composure. "Make her bow to the throne!" The guards lunged forward again. But Elara wasn't looking at them. She wasn't looking at the glowing iron, nor the furious Queen Mother. Her deep violet eyes were locked entirely on King Kaelen. She looked past the heavy crown, past the terrifying reputation of the obsidian dyer, straight into the silver-gray depths of his eyes. It was a look that stripped away the court, the politics, and the lies. It was a challenge, a silent question aimed directly at his honor. Are you a king of truth, or just a puppet of their laws? Kaelen felt that look like a physical impact against his chest. The heavy silver signet ring on his finger turned so cold it began to frost over. The air around the throne dropping in temperature until the torches flickered wildly. His wolf did not just snarl, it roared, a deafening primal sound that demanded he slaughter anyone who dared approach his mate with fire. The guards reached Elara, their heavy hands clamping down on her fragile shoulders to force her to the floor. Elara winced, but her violet eyes never left Kaelen's. She held his gaze, standing tall, waiting for the Iron Sovereign to make his choice. The heavy hands of the guards bore down on Elara's shoulders, trying to force her to the cold black marble. But she locked her knees, her boots bracing against the floor, her violet eyes still holding the king's silver-gray stare. She was a scribe. She was not a warrior. Yet the sheer, unyielding force of her will made the two massive guards struggle to bring her down. Standing nearby, Lady Seraphina's flawless composure shattered. The sight of this filthy, unaffiliated Omega openly defying the court, and worse, holding the Alpha King's undivided attention, was an insult Seraphina could not swallow. "You insolent little wretch!" Seraphina hissed, stepping forward. She handed the glowing branding iron back to the captain and raised her hand. The slap echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the Grand Archive Hall like a whip crack. The force of the blow snapped Elara's head to the side. A sharp sting erupted across her cheek, and the metallic taste of blood blossomed on her tongue as her lips split against her teeth. Her vision blurred for a fraction of a second, but she did not fall. She simply slowly, deliberately, turned her head back to face Seraphina. Elara did not raise a hand to touch her bleeding lip. Instead, a deep, ancient fury ignited in her chest, a rage not born of a scribe, but of a lineage that had ruled these lands long before the Valerius name existed. Inside her blood, something snapped. It sounded like the cracking of thick ice over a frozen lake. The magical seal that Queen Mother Valerius had secretly placed upon her as a child, the spell designed to bury her true nature beneath the scent of old paper and bitter ink, could not withstand the violent surge of her awakened bloodline. The seal shattered. In a single heartbeat, the stale smell of the archives vanished. A massive, suffocating wave of frost blooms swept through the great hall. It was not a subtle scent. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and terrifyingly pure. The undeniable, pristine scent of a royal winter luna. The air itself seemed to crystallize, a dusting of real frost spreading rapidly across the black marble beneath Elara's boots. On the throne, King Kaelen stopped breathing. The scent hit him with the force of a physical avalanche. His pupils blew wide, consuming the silver irises until his eyes were almost entirely black. The obsidian dire, the ancient beast he had kept leashed under layers of iron discipline, roared in his mind with world-shaking clarity. Mate. The revelation did not just strike Kaelen, it tore through him. The scribe he had been watching, the woman they were about to brand and cast out into the freezing wastes, was his fated mate, the true Luna of Frostpeak. Crack! The sound was deafening. Kaelen's grip on the armrest of the throne had tightened with such sudden, catastrophic force that the solid black marble pulverized under his fingers, sending shards of stone clattering down the dais steps. Down on the floor the elders gasped, stumbling backward as the overwhelming scent of a royal mate flooded their senses. The two guards holding Elara let go of her as if she were made of burning coals, their wolf instincts paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization of who they were touching. But Queen Mother Valerius did not freeze in awe. She froze in absolute, primal terror. Valerius recognized that scent. She knew what the breaking of the seal meant. The secret she had buried 20 years ago was standing before the court, bleeding and enraged. "Witchcraft!" Valerius shrieked, her voice cracking, completely devoid of her usual regal control. She pointed a trembling finger at Elara, her face pale with dread. "She is using blood magic to ensnare the king! She has cast a dark glamour upon the hall!" Seraphina backed away, horrified, staring at Elara as if she had turned into a monster. "Kill her!" Valerius screamed, her panic echoing off the stained walls. She turned wildly to the captain of the guard. "Do not let her speak! Cut her down right now! Execute the witch!" The captain, conditioned by decades of obeying the Queen Mother, drew his broadsword. The lethal scrape of steel filled the air as 3 more guards rushed forward, their blades raised, ready to slaughter the unarmed scribe where she stood. The broadswords slashed downward, aiming directly for Elara's neck. She did not flinch, and she did not close her eyes. She held the carved bone cylinder tightly against her chest, her violet eyes fixed on the descending steel. The blades never reached her. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated cold exploded through the grand archive hall. It was not a mere drop in temperature. It was a physical wall of frost that shattered the air itself. The captain of the guard and his men were thrown backward violently, their heavy swords ripped from their grips by the sheer force of the Alpha King's aura. The steel weapons clattered harmlessly onto the black marble, instantly covered in a thick layer of white rime. King Kaelen stood between Elara and the court. He had moved faster than the human eye could track. His broad back shielded her completely from the elders and the Queen Mother. The silver signet ring on his hand was now glowing with a harsh, icy light, and the ground beneath his boots was freezing over in jagged, expanding webs of ice. "The next man who draws a blade in my presence," Kaelen said, his voice dropping into a deadly, vibrating growl that shook the dust from the vaulted ceiling, "will lose his hands." The hall fell into a paralyzed silence. Even the elders, seasoned wolves who had lived through decades of war, dropped to their knees, unable to withstand the crushing pressure of their Alpha King's fury. Queen Mother Valerius grasped the edges of the dais to keep herself upright, her face pale. "Kaelen, you are protecting a witch! Her scent is a trick, a manipulation of blood magic to break your mind." Kaelen turned his head slightly, his silver-gray eyes locking onto his mother with a coldness that made the winter outside seem warm. "I am the Iron Sovereign," he said slowly, each word carrying the weight of a death sentence. "My mind is not broken, but my sight has been blind. I allowed this court to humiliate a scribe without demanding proof. I allowed forged decrees to dictate the law of my kingdom." He looked back at Lady Seraphina, who was shivering violently near the dais, her pristine ivory gown offering no protection against the freezing air. "I will not be manipulated into a false union, nor will I execute a woman simply because her existence terrifies you, Mother." Valerius gritted her teeth. "The council has passed judgment. You cannot simply overrule the law because this creature has clouded your senses. If she is not executed, she must be proven innocent under the ancient laws. She has no pack. She has no standing." "She has the stone," Kaelen countered, his voice cutting through her hysteria. "She translates the first winter. If you demand absolute proof of her innocence, and if you accuse her of blood magic, then let the oldest law of Frostpeak decide." Kaelen turned his gaze toward the center of the hall, where a massive circular dais of pale, untouched stone sat elevated above the black marble. It was an ancient relic, older than the castle itself. "I invoke the trial of the Moonstone Altar," Kaelen declared. A collective gasp swept through the kneeling elders. The Moonstone Altar had not been activated in 3 centuries. It was the ultimate arbiter of truth, a sacred stone that responded only to pure truth and true royal blood. It was said that any liar, or anyone attempting to claim a bloodline that was not theirs, would be instantly consumed by the altar's holy fire. Valerius stopped breathing for a moment. Then, slowly, a cruel, triumphant smile crept onto her lips. Her son was trying to protect the girl, but in doing so, he had just signed her death warrant. Valerius knew what Elara was, but she also knew the Moonstone Altar was notoriously lethal. A half-starved scribe, a hidden heir who had never been formally initiated into her power, would surely be burned alive by the altar's overwhelming magic. "Very well," Valerius sneered, her confidence returning. "Let the Moonstone One judge her. But when the altar burns this witch to ash, Kaelen, you will sign the mating pact with Seraphina before the sun sets." Kaelen did not answer his mother. He turned around to face Elara. She was still standing, the blood from her split lip dried against her pale chin. She looked at the towering Alpha King, the man who had just risked a rebellion to shield her from the blades. "Are you afraid of the stone, scribe?" Kaelen asked softly, his voice meant only for her. Elara looked past him, toward the pale, silent altar waiting in the center of the hall. She tightened her grip on the bone cylinder. "No, my king," Elara answered, her violet eyes steady and clear. "The stone and I have always known the truth." The Grand Archive Hall fell into a breathless, suffocating silence. King Kaelen stepped back. It was the hardest thing his wolf had ever done, to physically distance himself from his recognized mate while she stood on the precipice of a lethal magical trial. His silver-gray eyes never left her, his body coiled tight like a drawn bowstring, ready to tear the hall apart if the stone dared to harm a single hair on her head. But he knew she had to do this. He could shield her body with his sword, but only she could reclaim her stolen history. Elara walked slowly toward the center of the hall. Her gray tunic was stained with dust and melted snow. Her knees were battered, her lip was swollen, but she moved with a quiet, devastating grur. Ace. Every noble, every elder, and the Queen Mother watched her in absolute silence. The Moonstone Altar was a massive circular block of pale, unpolished stone, carved with faded runes that predated the Valerius bloodline. It radiated an ancient, dormant chill. Elara reached the base of the altar and stepped up. Queen Mother Valerius leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes wide, waiting for the inevitable spark, waiting for the holy fire to erupt and reduce the impudent scribe to ash. Elara stood before the flat surface of the stone. She took a deep breath. The split on her lip, aggravated by the cold air and her movement, tore open slightly. A single heavy drop of dark crimson blood welled up, fell from her chin, and struck the center of the pale altar. The entire hall collectively held its breath. Valerius smiled. But there was no fire. There was no smoke, no scent of burning flesh. Instead, the drop of blood seemed to sink directly into the solid rock. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, traveling up the legs of every wolf in the room. The stone did not reject her. It was recognizing her. Elara looked down at her hands. She was holding the carved bone cylinder, the only object her mother had managed to smuggle out of their ancestral home before she died in exile. For 20 years, Elara had protected it. For 20 years, she had remained silent. No more silence, she thought. Determined. With a sudden, deliberate motion, Elara raised the bone cylinder high and brought it crashing down against the hard, unyielding edge of the Moonstone Altar. The dry, ancient bone shattered with a sharp crack. Shards of bone scattered across the pale stone. From the broken ruins of the cylinder, a heavy object rolled out, catching the light of the silver torches. It was a scroll. But it was not made of parchment or leather. It was forged from pure, beaten gold, inscribed with runes that shimmered with an inner, ethereal light. It was the golden scroll of Ethelgard, the legendary covenant that detailed the true, unbroken lineage of the Moon Priestess line. The very lineage the Valerius family claimed had died out centuries ago. The moment the golden scroll touched the blood-stained surface of the altar, the reaction was instantaneous. A pillar of blinding, pure white light erupted from the stone, rocketing upward to illuminate the vaulted ceiling. The light was so bright, so overwhelming, that Lady Seraphina screamed and covered her eyes, dropping to her knees. The elders stumbled backward, throwing their arms up to shield their faces. But Elara did not close her eyes. She stood perfectly still within the column of light, bathing in the raw, ancient magic of her ancestors. The pain at the back of her neck vanished. In its place, a surge of boundless, terrifying power flooded her veil. The crescent moon birthmark burned through the fabric of her gray tunic, glowing with a brilliant silver-white luminescence that was visible to everyone in the hall. And then came the sound. It did not echo in the physical room. It echoed directly in the minds of every wolf present. A long, haunting, ethereal howl, the voice of the white wolf, a silent guardian that had waited for 20 years to finally be heard. It was a sound of absolute sovereignty, of deep magic, and of a queen reclaiming her throne. King Kaelen stood at the edge of the light. His wolf did not cower. His wolf knelt in absolute reverence within his mind. The light slowly faded, leaving a soft silver glow radiating from the altar. Elara stood there, holding the golden scroll in her ink-stained hands. The dust had settled. The seal was broken. The scribe was gone. The White Queen had awakened. The lingering silver light cast long, dramatic shadows across the grand archive hall. Elara stood by the Moonstone Altar, her breathing steady, the golden scroll resting in her ink-stained hands. The air was no longer suffocating with dust and fear. It was crisp, sharp, and thick with the undeniable scent of frost bloom. Lady Seraphina was still on her knees, the forged decree of exile having slipped from her trembling fingers to lay forgotten on the cold marble floor. Queen Mother Valeria stared at the altar, her face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. The spell was broken. The truth she had buried with the blood of Elara's mother was now radiating in the center of the court for all to see. "An illusion!" Valerius gasped, her voice shrill and desperate as she scrambled forward, pointing at the altar. "Do not be fooled, elders! It is a trick of the light, a scribe's parlor trick. That scroll is a forgery!" King Kaelen did not shout. He simply raised his right hand. The silver signet ring of the Iron Sovereign, an ancient artifact bound to the truth of the Frostpeak bloodline, reacted violently to Valerius's words. It did not just glow, it flash-froze. A jagged spike of solid ice shot out from the metal, cracking the air itself. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of a devastating lie. The elders gasped, stepping back in unison. The ring never lied. Kaelen lowered his hand. He walked slowly toward the altar, his boots clicking heavily against the stone. He stopped right beside Elara, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her, though she no longer needed it. "The Moonstone Altar has accepted her blood," Kaelen said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "The golden scroll of Aethelgard has answered her touch. My wolf has recognized her scent, and my ring has condemned your words." He turned his silver-gray eyes toward his mother. There was no warmth left in them, only the merciless chill of a sovereign who had just realized his entire reign had been built on a foundation of deceit. "You knew," Kaelen stated. It was not a question. "You sealed her scent. You forced the true heir of the Moon Priestess line to live as an unaffiliated Omega, scrubbing ink from the floors of the archives, while you paraded false mates in front of my throne." Valerius trembled, taking a step back. "I did it for Frostpeak. The Moon Priestess line holds too much power. They share the throne. They dilute the Alpha's authority. I protected your crown, Kaelen." "You protected your pride," Elara spoke. Her voice was calm, yet it resonated through the hall with the strange, layered acoustics of a royal mandate. She did not look at the Queen Mother with hatred. She looked at her with the heavy, cold judgment of a true monarch. "The texts you ordered me to mistranslate clearly stated that the Obsidian Dire and the White Wolf must rule together," Elara continued, holding up the golden scroll. "A kingdom with a severed bond is a kingdom cursed to freeze. You did not protect Frostpeak. You starved it." Seraphina let out a pathetic sob, pressing her forehead to the floor, desperately trying to make herself invisible. The flawless, ambitious lady of the court was completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the power in the room. Kaelen looked down at Seraphina, then back to his mother. "The law of the first winter is absolute," Kaelen declared, his voice ringing like a struck anvil. "Treason against the bloodline is punishable by stripping of all titles and lands." Valerius shook her head wildly. "You cannot do this. I am the Queen Mother. I gave you life." "You gave me life, but you stole my mate," Kaelen replied, his jaw tight with restrained fury. "And you nearly forced me to execute the true Queen of Frostpeak." Kaelen drew his ceremonial broadsword. The scrape of the steel made the remaining guards stiffen, but Kaelen did not step toward his mother. He brought the flat of the blade down onto the black marble with a resounding final crash. Valerius, Seraphina, by the power of the Iron Sovereign, you are stripped of your names, your ranks, and your protections. You are no longer of the royal house. You will face the council's judgment for treason, and you will be exiled into the winter wastes. The decree was absolute. The court stood in stunned silence as the two women, once the most powerful figures in the kingdom, were dragged away by the very guards they had commanded just moments before. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Archive Hall slammed shut, sealing the fate of the Queen Mother and the false Luna. Silence reclaimed the vast stone room, but it was no longer the silence of fear or oppression. It was the heavy, breathless silence of absolute awe. The scent of frostbloom had settled over the court, an undeniable physical weight that demanded submission from every wolf present. The 12 elders of the council stood frozen at the base of the dais. Just an hour ago, these were the wolves who had casually ordered Elara's flesh to be burned. They had sneered at her ink-stained fingers and her frayed gray tunic. Now, they were staring at the glowing golden scroll of Ethelgard in those very same hands. Slowly, the eldest member of the council dropped to his knees. The harsh thud of bone against the black marble echoed in the hall. One by one, the rest of the elders followed. The captain of the guard, the nobles, the remaining soldiers, every single person in the hall lowered themselves to the freezing stone, bowing their heads in profound, humiliating regret. The pack knelt, not because they were forced down by violence, but because the sheer magnitude of their own ignorance had crushed them. Elara looked out over the sea of bowed heads. She did not smile. There was no petty thrill of revenge in her chest, no desire to see them bleed the way they had wanted her to bleed. She only felt the quiet, heavy settling of justice. The history she had guarded for 20 years was finally breathing the open air. A sharp, metallic clack broke the silence. King Kaelen sheathed his broadsword. He did not look at the kneeling court. His silver-gray eyes were locked entirely on Elara. He walked slowly toward the Moonstone Altar. With every step, the Iron Sovereign stripped away the armor of his absolute authority. He stopped at the base of the altar and looked up at her. He saw the dust on her clothes. He saw the dark bruise forming on her jaw and the dried blood on her split lip. He saw the exact cost of his court's cruelty and his own blindness. "You asked me, with just a look, if I was a king of truth," Kaelen said. His voice was quiet now, stripped of the terrifying roar of the obsidian dire. "I was not. I allowed the law to become a weapon against the very blood it was meant to protect. I demanded absolute obedience to the stone, while ignoring the woman who actually knew how to read it." Elara held his gaze, her violet eyes deep and unreadable. She held the golden scroll against her chest, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King of Frostpeak lowered himself. The man who had never bowed to another living soul, the ruthless sovereign who commanded the fiercest warriors of the winter wastes, dropped to one knee on the hard stone before the unaffiliated scribe. He bowed his head, exposing his throat to her in the ultimate gesture of wolf submission. "I offer no excuses, my queen," Kaelen said, his voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered devotion. "Only my life, my wolf, and my blade. If you demand my exile for my failure to protect you sooner, I will walk into the winter wastes myself." The court held its collective breath, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The fate of the Alpha King now rested entirely in the ink-stained hands of the woman they had all tried to destroy. Elara looked down at the Alpha King. The Iron Sovereign, the man who had terrified the winter wastes, was kneeling before her. She did not ask him to rise immediately. A kingdom built on lies could not be healed in a single moment of submission. "You will not walk into the wastes, Kaelen," Elara said softly, her voice carrying over the silent hall. "You will stay. You will stand by the stone, and you will help me tear down every false law the Valerius name built." Kaelen looked up, his silver-gray eyes meeting hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a burning, absolute loyalty. "My life is yours, my queen, until the last winter." She reached out, her ink-stained fingers gently touching his jaw. The frost bloom scent wrapped around them, sealing a bond that no court, no elder, and no false decree could ever break again. The White Queen had returned to Frostpeak, and the Iron Sovereign would never look away from her again. Sometimes, the truth they try to bury is the very power that brings a kingdom to its knees. Do you think Elara was right to make him wait before forgiving his court's cruelty? If you love stories of rejected mates, protective alpha kings, and queens rising from the shadows, subscribe and return for the next tale.